Welcome to the Philosophy channel. In this seminar, we will discuss Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility. Benjamin's essay is also sometimes translated as The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So you may find it under that title. So the hope for this seminar, the overview for this seminar, includes a look at the title, looking at the text's present historical context, looking at the 5 different versions of the text, and this is kind of complicated, but it's worth getting clear on. And from what I saw of the discussions on YouTube regarding Benjamin's essay, most people are not clear on this. Then we're going to discuss the essay in terms of an overview of the sections, and then engage in a textual analysis of the text. Okay, so in regard to its title, we see the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction versus the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility. When considering inventions like the printing press, the former title lends itself well, in my opinion. However, when we consider the information age and digital versus analog reproduction, for example, the latter title lends itself well. So really, I think it's just sort of good to know that it kind of depends on who the publisher and who the translator is as to what you're getting, but to be able to recognize the title in regard to both of its translations. Okay. The text's present historical context. So, in my opinion, Walter Benjamin's work is brilliant. At one point in time, I was beginning to formulate a doctoral dissertation that involved Walter Benjamin. I eventually did not pursue Benjamin in terms of the dissertation, but initially I was immersed in Benjamin's work, and his prose style speaks for itself. Very beautiful writing. Reading, for example, One Way Street is quite an enjoyable experience. And if you're looking at his collected works translated into English, that's in volume 1 of the 4-volume set, although there's 2 parts to the second volume. So Benjamin's text, The Work of Art, fits well in a trajectory with Debord's The Society of the Spectacle and Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, and of course The Perfect Crime as well. Ultimately, whatever torch Benjamin's text carries in terms of the philosophy of technology, that torch was long ago passed to Baudrillard. And you're going to see this is going to come up at several times throughout this seminar. But at the same time, there's a lot of value in considering Benjamin's text. And so I thought it was important to look at this. And it also, by putting together a seminar on Benjamin's The Work of Art, it provides a nice groundwork for us to consider some other texts, not the least of which, for example, would be The Society of the Spectacle, Simulacra and Simulation, and The Perfect Crime. I've said this before, I really like Baudrillard's work. The Perfect Crime is such an amazing text, or collection of essays. All right, so here we go. In terms of the 5 versions of Benjamin's essay, so the history of Benjamin's text has many twists and turns. Ultimately, Here is the solution to the puzzle of how to think about the 5 versions found amongst Benjamin's writings. So many people will only speak about 3 versions, but there's technically 5 versions. And at different times, these different versions have been referred to by different numbers. And so therefore, this becomes very complicated. It actually took me some time to straighten this out. But it seems to me, rather than just referring to them as versions and trying to figure out which version it's referred to by who or by whom, and then coming back and getting the correct version, it's best to just put it in a timeline. Okay, so in terms of a timeline, we have the autumn of 1935, and the autumn 1935 version is presented without an epigraph, and it was written in German. Early 1936, the early 1936 version, so I consider the autumn 1935 version to be the first version, early 1936 version to be the second version. And in this version, this is the version that Benjamin prepared for publication. He wrote this in German also. Then there is the May of 1936 version. This was the only version that was actually published during Benjamin's lifetime. This text was published in French, and it's a considerably edited version of the second version of the early 1936 version. If you go through Benjamin's letters around this period of time, it does seem as though Benjamin was not happy with some of the editing that occurred. I can empathize with that. That's why independent publishing is the way to go. But in either case, it is a version of the text published on its own and in French. So you can see that it differs from the second version because it was significantly edited. And then there is the fourth version, which is from 1938. This version is considered the work in progress version. I mean, Benjamin himself considered it a work in progress. And it was intended for publication, but was not fully prepared for publication, hence the work in progress. It was given to Adorno, actually given to Adorno's wife, I believe, but in either case, it was put in the possession of Adorno, and it was published in 1955. Often you hear this referred to as the third version of the text, but technically, because if you don't count the French version, then it becomes tricky as to how many versions there are and so on and so forth. But technically, this is the fourth version. So I refer to this as the fourth version, the 1938 fourth version. And then lastly, the 1935 collected and suggested from his notes version. I have not seen this version translated into English, but you can find it in his complete works in German. It is considered, again, a kind of standalone text. And so the story of the changes across these texts is interesting, and the differences across the text is interesting, but it's beyond the scope of our talk. I initially started to work out a document that indicated all the changes from version 1 to version 2 and version 2 to version 4, for example, because those I'm working with 1, 2, and 4. And yet, as I started to go with this, I thought this is going to become, this is not something for a video, it's something for maybe for an essay or something in writing somewhere. And I just thought, I just had to abandon it. But I did do that research. I did examine and contrast these different versions. So at times I will be quoting from different versions. And then lastly, throughout the history of this text, the numbering of the versions has been confused in many ways. And so I still think that this is, thinking of it in terms of a timeline and in terms of what language it was written in, and of course the fourth and fifth versions are in German, then you're able to get a grip on it. All right. So at a glance then, and I wanted you to be able to see these because I provide my own section titles, but I wanted you to be able to see Benjamin's section titles. So these are the section headings from Benjamin's complete works. You can see that he has the foreword, technological reproducibility, authenticity, destruction of the aura, ritual and politics, cult value and exhibition value, photography, eternal value, photography and film as art, film and test performance, the film actor, exhibition in front of a mass, the aspiration to be filmed, painter and cameraman, reception of paintings, Mickey Mouse, Dadaism, tactile and optical reception, and aesthetics of war. So those are Benjamin's section titles, and here are my section titles. The preface, the current modes of production in the work of art, mechanical reproduction, aura versus hyperreality. And so this is probably the place to mention that. So as these are my section titles, and I'm suggesting these titles because they are, of course, anachronistic. So, for example, hyperreality was not a concept that was operable or around when Benjamin wrote the essay, The Work of Art. However, I think that it's important to use anachronistic section headings here, section titles, because it helps constellate Benjamin's text with other texts, or with other philosophical concepts. And I think that that's helpful, especially when we're thinking about this text. So you'll see then section 4, technological mediation, which I continue to think is a very important philosophical concept. I think that it's still a little bit ahead of its time. I don't think people have recognized the value of this concept yet. Tradition as context of art, cult value versus exhibition value, photography and legacy, cinema in the service of capital, the point of view of the camera, the crisis of the theater, in framing reality in terms of the spectacle. You can hear some Heidegger and Debord in there. The cameraman versus the painter, which is essentially what his title was. Critical versus progressive attitude to art, unconscious optics, close-ups and slow motion, the hijacking of thought, the spectacle's sleight of hand, and then the epilogue, fascism and social media as consolation. All right. So those are my suggested section headings. Writing in the first half of the 20th century, Benjamin's critique echoes exponentially throughout that century into ours. Namely, though the thinkers at the end of the 19th century could foresee that technology would increase its grip on humanity, they could not fully nor precisely foresee how humanity would change through its technologically mediated relation to itself and experience. The social and economic consequences of such technological mediation, as evidenced by the developmental tendencies of art, brush aside a number of outmoded concepts. These are Benjamin's words. Concepts such as creativity and genius, eternal value and mystery. In an October 16, 1935 letter to Max Horkheimer, Benjamin noted, quote, "For us, the fatal hour of art has struck." So this was 1935. "And I have situated the point in a series of brief reflections dealing with the following title, The Work of Art." So you can see how Benjamin is contextualizing this in his letters around the time that he's writing this. Next, what is fascism? And this is actually a very difficult term to define, it seems to me. So though there are many ways to characterize it, the perhaps best general characterization is all-out government support for business and severe repression of activities considered anti-business. So all capitalism all the time. In terms of urbanization, the conversion of nature into city, technologically mediated fascism is in principle unlimited. I asked, I wrote that sentence, and then I thought about that sentence, and then I wrote, I was like, is that true? Is that actually true? Can I really say that it's unlimited? But I do believe that it is unlimited in principle, right? And at the same time, this idea of converting, for example, converting farms into business and the industrial military complex and so on and so forth, that, at the same time, it is important, especially at this early 21st century stage, to not think in terms of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, a more nuanced position in regard to capitalism and urbanization brings forth ideas regarding sustainability. Supposedly, we see all of the theft that's occurring in California presently. There's, evidently a lot of it happening all over the West Coast. I don't think that's the answer either, right? So this idea that somehow in order to combat fascism, we need to just dismantle the state or completely destroy all business. I don't think that that's actually possible. However, it's important for us to, in order to lay the groundwork, so to speak, for this text or the analysis of Benjamin's text, for us to at least consider these ideas, okay, put them on the table, so to speak. So, put another way, it is not immediately clear that supporting business is in and of itself a fascist activity, right? However, in regard to the work of art, especially in regard to what we see happening now with artificial intelligence, it seems technologically mediated art has, as Benjamin noticed nearly a century ago, irretrievably entered into its fascist fatal hour. Okay. I've taught this text in the classroom multiple times, and I always liked how the first section, the beginning of the essay, how it correctly predicted cable TV and the internet, quoting Paul Valéry, just as water, gas, and electric are brought into our houses from far off to satisfy our needs in response to a minimal effort, so we shall be supplied with visual or auditory images, which will appear and disappear at a simple movement of the hand. We can think now of Alexa and Siri and Google and the Internet of Things and Spotify and so on and so forth. Just an amazing prediction by Paul Valéry. Benjamin points out in this section that the work of art has always been reproducible. However, the increasing technological capacities represent something new. Quote, represent something new, end quote. I think that that's important, again, writing in 1935. Namely, technology's penetration of the ontological. And I think that this is a good way to put it. Benjamin uses this verbiage as well, but this penetration has led to process reproduction and technical reproduction. So process reproduction, the technological production of works of art, has penetrated the ontological quality of a work's authenticity. So this is something that's going to be explored in this essay, and I think it's a very important idea to think about. In terms of technical reproduction, the technological process of reproduction has itself become a work of art. So a film, for example, is composed of a series of photographs. Still, and the idea here then is that the advancement of technology made the camera a reality, And then out of that, an entire new art form manifest. For example, film. So hence you can see this distinction as to what's going on here, that technology is penetrated all the way to the quality of a work of art's authenticity, and that's an ontological quality, and then also that technology has penetrated reality to such an extent that it has now produced, it is the condition for the possibility of a new form of art, namely film. Okay, so from printing as the mechanical reproduction of writing to lithography, illustration, making graphic art possible, from photography to the silent film and beyond. So this is in the second section of Benjamin's essay. And I thought that we're going to get a little closer to the text here in a moment, but I thought that this was a really good way to, again, set the stage for this discussion. So, in regard to the penetration of the ontological by technology, in his 6 memos for the next millennium, Italo Calvino wrote, "We are bombarded today by such a quantity of images that we can no longer distinguish direct experience from what we have seen for a few seconds on television. The memory is littered with bits of pieces of images like a rubbish dump." And of course, you can imagine I think this was 1984 that Calvino wrote this. So that's 1984. You can imagine, how true this is nowadays with social media and just, now we have, for example, doom scrolling and just this idea of these 7-second video clips and so on and so forth, just sort of filling the memory and filling your mind with this information. So I think ontologically, many people today are hip to this idea that criteriologically social media and new media are somehow invading or somehow influencing us criteriologically. But I think that people are still missing, or it's just not a very popular topic to think about how social media and new media are affecting us ontologically. That's something that I'm very much interested in, though. Okay, and so again, in terms of the second section of Benjamin's text, art has always been in principle reproducible. However, now with the new technologies that we have, and of course he was, didn't even dream of some of the technologies that we have nowadays, that with these new technologies, there is something new in regard to their reproduction, the reproduction of works of art. All right, so section 3 now, here's where we really start to get into the meat of the text. So the aura, and my title for this section, of course, is Aura versus Hyperreality. So the following quote from Benjamin's 1931 essay, A Little History of Photography, helps us understand the everyday world into which the technology of photography was thrust. And I think it's good to be reminded of this, right? So the first people to be reproduced technologically entered the visual space of photography with their innocence intact, or rather without inscription. Newspapers were still a luxury item, which people seldom bought, preferring to consult them in the coffee house. Photography had not yet become a journalistic tool, and ordinary people had yet to see their names in print. I still remember, what a big deal it was if a reporter from the newspaper, like when I was a child, if a reporter from the newspaper came by, somebody would show up with a camera and be taking a picture of some event, and then later you'd see a picture of yourself in the newspaper, and in the caption, and you could read your name, and this was just so important. Everybody had to cut it out and save it, and people would come by with copies of the newspaper for you, and these kinds of things. Benjamin talks about this, and it's actually really worth considering. I almost became nostalgic about it. I was like, oh, that's right. I forgot that was a thing back then. Okay. To what then does aura refer? Recalling the concept of authenticity from existentialism and the concept of the principle of individuation from the metaphysics of cosmology, Benjamin noted, in even the most perfect reproduction, one thing is lacking: the here and now of the work of art, its unique existence in a particular place, right? And of course, that was considered a principle of individuation amongst the early modern philosophers. It is this unique existence and nothing else that bears the mark of the history to which the work has been subject. So we're trying to get this answer. What is aura? The here and now of the original. So you're going to see original, copy, hyperreal. So it's coming here. The here and now of the original underlies the concept of its authenticity. And on the latter, on authenticity, in turn is founded the idea of a tradition which has passed the object down as the same, identical thing to the present day. So this is the original. There are many copies, but this is the original. The whole sphere of authenticity eludes technological, and of course not only technological, reproduction. But whereas the authentic work retains its full authority in the face of a reproduction made by hand, which it generally brands a forgery, for example, this is not the case with technological reproduction. I'm not going to be reading this essay to you, but there are excerpts from this essay that I think are worth reading together. The reason is twofold. First, technological reproduction is more independent of the original than is manual reproduction. The overtones of that statement are funny. For example, in photography, it can bring out aspects of the original that are accessible only to the lens, which is adjustable and can easily change viewpoint, but not to the human eye. Or it can use certain processes such as enlargement or slow motion to record images which escape natural optics altogether. When I watch movies now, I was, for the longest time, I resisted technology. And I still believe all the things that I believed about technology, but I find myself trying to learn about technology more all the time. And so I had no idea about lighting and LUTs, for example. But now when I watch movies, I think to myself, that is a LUT. They've applied a LUT to this scene, and that's why it appears the way that it does. I wanted to apply LUTs to these videos, but I was like, you know what? There's so much built into these videos already, and it's taking me so much time to make them that I don't need to add LUTs to the post-production process. So anyway, again, this idea that with today's technology, there are so many things that can be done above and beyond manual reproduction. This is the first reason, okay? The second reason, then, technological reproduction can place the copy of the original in situations which the original itself cannot attain. Above all, it enables the original to meet the recipient halfway, whether in the form of a photograph or in that of a gramophone record. So, nowadays, this was one of the things that we had suggested about the way in which technological mediation and mechanical reproduction has invaded the classroom. So, if you watch some of the early Great Courses videos, you will see that these professors take great pride in describing artworks. And I think that that's a throwback to this idea that if you were the professor in the room, that it may very well be the case that no one has a picture that you can access without the internet, for example. No one has a picture of this artwork, and no one else in the room has seen this artwork. So you get to describe this artwork to your students. Think about how much time this takes up. And then not only are you describing this artwork to your students, but then there's some air of, grandiosity because you're the only one who's seen this work of art. So you can talk about how glorious this work of art is, and everyone in the room has to just take your word for it, right? And I think in some way that was kind of an essential role of the professor, right? Certainly it's still the case in terms of the professor has read material that the students have not read. In the information age, they have access to it, but they haven't read it, right? So there's these big differentiating features, like what makes the professor different from the audience. And I think that with increasing technological mediation, the position of the professor is undermined, right? The necessity of all of the things that were packed into being a professor previously, that these things are no longer necessary, right? I mean, instead of describing the picture, professor, why don't you just show us a picture of it, right? Instead of describing the painting, just show us a picture of it. So really, this is also a powerful idea coming out of Benjamin's essay. The cathedral, picking up where we left off, the cathedral leaves its site to be received in the studio of an art lover. The choral work performed in an auditorium or in the open air is enjoyed in a private room. And I think I can't remember exactly the dates on these. I'd have to go back and look. However, I believe that in 1955, when the translation of Benjamin's text appeared by way of Adorno, I think that the vinyl records had been around for 15 years, 16 years. So, but of course, the gramophone was around at the time of Benjamin's writing this. So again, this idea that it's some kind of tremendous leap to be able to listen to a symphony in your house, I think that we overlook that, right? This is just something that we just take for granted now. And what is really jeopardized when the historical testimony is affected is the authority of the object, the weight it derives from tradition, right? One might focus these aspects of the artwork in the concept of the aura and go on to say what withers in the age of the technological reproducibility of the work of art is its aura. This process is symptomatic. Its significance extends far beyond the realm of art. It might be stated as a general formula that the technology of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the sphere of tradition. And this, of course, is exactly what Baudrillard is going to pick up on, and then in terms of this idea of hyper-reality, that somehow this copy, there's copies without originals, and that somehow the copy is better than the original, and so on and so forth. So that's not possible unless the authority, right, that confers such status on the original is somehow undermined. But of course, the technological mediation has undermined that authority. It has undermined that authority by way of extracting the work of art from tradition. You're going to see Benjamin describe it in other ways as well. But so this came to mind immediately, and I wanted to make sure that we put it on the table here as well. The aura of a work of art is nullified by technological reproducibility. NFTs may be understood as a failed attempt to technologically reproduce the aura, right? So I think that's worth considering. I think in a sense it would be a technologically mediated aura, right? A technologically mediated tradition and a technologically mediated aura. So then lastly, in regard to section 3, from Benjamin's 1931 essay, Little History of Photography, he referred to the law that new advances are prefigured in old or older techniques, asking, what is aura? He says, what is aura actually? A strange weave of space and time, the unique appearance or semblance of distance, no matter how close it may be. That's a really brilliant turn of phrase by Benjamin. While at rest on a summer's noon, to trace a range of mountains on the horizon, or a branch that throws its shadow on the observer, until the moment or the hour become part of their appearance. This is what it means to breathe, the aura of the mountains, that branch, the aura of that tree. Now, to bring things closer to us, or rather to the masses, is just as passionate an inclination in our day as the overcoming of whatever is unique in every situation by means of its reproduction. And that sentence right there, I think, signals archive fever, right? I mean, in essence, Benjamin is talking about archive fever right there. Every day, the need to possess the object in close up in the form of a picture, or rather a copy, becomes more imperative. And the difference between the copy, which illustrated papers and newsreels keep in readiness, and the original picture is unmistakable. Uniqueness and duration are as intimately intertwined in the latter as are transience and reproducibility in the former, the copy and the original. The peeling away of the object's shell, the destruction of the aura, is the signature of a perception whose sense for the sameness of things has grown to the point where even the singular, the unique, is divested of its uniqueness by means of its reproduction. So again, Benjamin, in a sense, was able to foresee hyperreality. It just, well, on the one hand, he didn't live long enough, and also, he just wasn't able to thematize it in the way that Baudrillard, of course, thematized it. Okay, so hyperreality, as we discussed in other places, in, for example, the seminar on postmodernism, and we will, I'm sure, discuss again, it's everywhere, refers to a state of affairs in which copies are so good they replace their originals. I'm actually in the process of putting together a seminar on Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation. So we'll be talking about this explicitly here soon. In this way, Benjamin's observations regarding the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility give way to Baudrillard's observation of the hyperreal. All right, section 4. So I take technological mediation to be a central theme coming from the texts discussed throughout this seminar. Technological mediation has both criteriological and ontological consequences, and possibly soteriological ones too. Here, Benjamin points to an ontological consequence of technological mediation. Just as the entire mode of existence of human collectives changes over long historical periods, so too does their mode of perception. The way in which human perception is organized, the medium in which it occurs, is conditioned not only by nature but by history. So the above is from section 4 of the second version of the Work of Art essay. And this is the beginning of section 4 from the fourth 1938 version. During long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of existence. The manner in which human sense perception is organized, the medium in which it is accomplished, is determined not only by nature, but by historical circumstances as well. And so this idea that what Benjamin is packing into this idea of historical circumstances or history in addition to nature is that the increasing capacities of technology can be understood as historical circumstances, right? And that they as we mentioned already, that they are ontologically penetrating nature. So there is an aura of historical objects and an aura of natural ones, according to Benjamin. And likewise, there are technological and social causes of the changing or nullification of these auras. So today, the conditions for an analogous insight are more favorable. And if changes in the medium of present-day perception can be understood as a decay of the aura, it is possible to demonstrate the social determinants of that decay. So it's at this point that Benjamin brings in this idea of social influence, and the social influence combined with technological mediation that is then altering, we could say, the ontology of nature, or, for example, the natural aura. Okay. So in this section 4, Benjamin makes two explicit statements that are worth repeating. The first one, increasing technological mediation may be socially motivated, and the destruction of aura can result from a technologically mediated perception whose, quote, sense of the universal equality of things, end quote, motivates its social extraction by means of technological reproduction. So I think there are lots of overtones here. This idea of that the destruction of aura can be socially motivated. Thus is manifested in the field of perception what in the theoretical space is noticeable in the increasing importance of statistics, right? This is 1935. The adjustment of reality to the masses and of the masses to reality is a process of unlimited scope, as much for thinking as for perception. And that is from section 4 of the 4th version also. And it's the translation that is found in Illuminations, the collection of Benjamin essays. All right. Section 5 then, tradition as the proper context of art. Okay, so this is the beginning of section 5 from the 1938 version. The uniqueness of the work of art is identical to its embeddedness in the context of tradition. Of course, this tradition itself is thoroughly alive and extremely changeable. An ancient statue of Venus, for instance, existed in a traditional context for the Greeks, who made it an object of worship. That was different from the context in which it existed for medieval clerics, who viewed it as a sinister idol. The passage continues, but what was equally evident to both was its uniqueness, that is, its aura. Originally, the embeddedness of a work of art in the context of tradition found expression in a cult. As we know, the earliest artworks originated in the service of rituals, first magical, then religious. And it is highly significant that the artwork's auratic mode of existence is never entirely severed from its ritual function. In other words, the unique value of the authentic work of art has its basis in ritual, the source of its original use value. So this insight suggests the following. Though tradition can change, it is as if extracting the work of art from tradition affects a paradigm shift. The work of art as a work of technological reproducibility, and as we will see, of politics. So the work of art as a work of politics lays the groundwork for the nullification of aura. So the passage concludes, an analysis of art in the age of mechanical reproduction must do justice to these relationships, for they lead us to an all-important insight. For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. And I have problems with the translation of that word as parasitical. I think that it should say something more like it's necessary dependence on ritual, or historically necessary dependence on ritual. But so, I'm sorry. So for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its necessary dependence on ritual. To an ever greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes the work of art designed for reproducibility. From a photographic negative, for example, and maybe many of the people hearing this don't even know what a photographic negative is, but from a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. But the instant the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, and that practice, of course, is politics. I distinctly remember, there was some sense in which if you wanted to look at a photograph, you had to carry this physical photograph with you. Now, of course, everybody's got these images on their phones. But when you had to carry the photograph with you, there was a sense in which, I liked to carry certain photographs with me. And it's not like you had a lot of photographs because it cost money every time you took a picture. So, there was some sense in which there was a greater sense of scarcity, and also being embedded in something physically real, very different situation than just, its reproducibility as a digital image. So, but it's very interesting to me how my relationship to images now is so different from my relationship to images then. So, back then it seemed like the image was a reproduction, and that reproduction was somehow fragile. It didn't exist in the cloud, so to speak, right? And so it was fragile, and therefore it was very easy, as to use a Freudian term here, to cathexis these photographs, right? It was very easy to imbue these photographs with some kind of like psychic and emotional value, right? And even to almost look at these images and be inspired by them. And I feel as though certainly we can still be inspired by images, but there's just some intimacy that is radically lost, right? Just some, I think intimacy is the right word. Okay, so notice then, when the aura vanishes, the function changes. There is an ontological relation between the function of a being and the actuality of its aura. And Aristotle's on the slide here because, of course, that's a kind of Aristotelian idea, thinking about the relationship between function and the actuality of its aura. And I just want to mention, by the way, that, it's very interesting to me that I was very opposed to PowerPoint. At one point in time in my life, I was like, well, I'm not going to put together PowerPoints, that somehow it diminished the authenticity of the lecture. And yet then I started to realize that I didn't have to write on the board anywhere near as much if I just typed it into a slide once and then projected it onto a screen. And it was like, to save my arm, that I was persuaded, among other reasons, I will admit, but that I was persuaded to convert to PowerPoint. And if you've seen any of the philosophemes that I put together, it is possible I could animate everything. We could just animate everything on here. But the amount of work that goes into all of that, for me at least, the amount of work that goes into all of that I guess if I were a robot or something, or, if you could just say, hey Siri, or, hey, whatever your name is, hey robot, make me a slide and make these words dance in this way or something, maybe that'd be a very different experience. But well, I'm certain it would be a different experience, but I just wanted to point out that there was a point in time when I was very critical of even PowerPoints. There was also a point in my life when I refused to watch television. I just refused to watch it. I was like, I'm not gonna, when I was at Kenyon College, for example, I just refused to watch it. If somebody wanted to show me something on TV, I don't need to see it. And then I think what got me was movies. People wanted me, it's like once I started working, then it was like, well, I'm too tired to read this book. I think I'm just going to watch a movie. And, and so many people were recommending movies to me. And then once I started watching movies, or should I say cinema, but once I started watching these films, I then started to think like, oh, there's so many ways to think about these films, and started to sort of get into the philosophy of film, if you will. And then I was just sort of caught, and now I watch TV, I watch movies every chance I get, I guess, although I feel as though movies are dying too. Anyway, so you can see that there is an ontological relation between the function of a being and the actuality of its aura. The following passage then comes from the last paragraph of Benjamin's 1935 first version of the work of art. He says, in films, the technological reproducibility of the product is not an externally imposed condition of its mass dissemination, as it is, say, in literature or painting. The technological reproducibility of film or films is based directly on the technology of their production. So that I think this is obvious, but in other words, just like the reality of social media became possible through technological mediation, technological advances can institute entirely new contexts otherwise not possible. According to Benjamin, technology can be seen in this way as a condition for the possibility of film. We already mentioned this earlier as well. But it is worth noting also that Jacques Ellul, his discussion of the social effects of motor vehicles develops this exact same logic. Just a sort of, I just want to make I don't want to digress here too much, but just two quick points. The one is that, I realized the very first time, so I remember I had a smartphone in my hand for the very first time, and I had to be talked into it, right? So, I didn't want a cell phone. I don't need a cell phone. And, this was like flip phone kind of stuff. I had cell phones, but when I was, a PhD student, I was like, I don't think I need a cell phone. I don't want a cell phone. And then smartphones came around, and someone, was like, well, hey, here's this situation, we can get into this contract and then, buy a phone, get a phone, we'll split the thing, blah, 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 so, okay. So now I've got a smartphone in my hand, right? And I don't know, what's going on with this smartphone, but I do have a smartphone in my hand. And so I distinctly remember the very first time we were driving someplace, and we were in essence, we were lost, right? We didn't know how to get to where we were going from where we were. And I thought to myself, and I said out loud, I said, isn't there a map in these phones? Like, can't I pull up a map? So I open the phone up and I select the map, and I said out loud, I said, what is this blue dot? And then I said, oh my gosh, that's us. So maybe that sounds crazy to you, but when I lived in Paris, I did not have GPS. So I was lost often. I had to pull out a paper map. I was lost often in Paris, in the streets of Paris. One of my favorite activities was just to go get lost, right? Just wander around. I think I walked, for 12 hours straight. I would stop and have snacks and look at things and take pictures. But for like 12 hours straight, many days. Sometimes the weather would change 3 times while I was out on a walk. And anyway, what is my point of all this? Okay, so the point is that it's almost as if you can't get lost anymore. it's not possible to be lost, right? Like no matter where I am, I can just look at my phone and know exactly where I am, right? And everybody else can know where I am too if they want, So that's an ontological penetration, right? I mean, so the human experience is now radically different. And I recognize that there's pros and cons to all of this, but that's not the point that we're making. The point that we're making is that technology and technological mediation is able to fundamentally alter human experience of reality. And to such an extent that there were aspects of human reality that are now eclipsed or have completely vanished, right? I think that's really profound. And the Jacques Ellul story, very quickly here, is that he said, there's this sense in which, and again, it's completely correct to my mind, right? He says that before you could travel to faraway cities so easily, there was a sense in which you were confined to a space. And in that space, you were confined to that space with other people who were confined to that space. And so therefore, everyone who was confined to that space knew each other. And because it's like a small town, right? So everyone who's confined to that space, because they know each other, there is a sense in which there is a kind of accountability that is present, right? Because you can't, if you try to get away with doing something, they're going to know it's you, right? And then Ellul talks about how the ability to travel to another town where you can be anonymous. And you can think about this now, some fool with like a excerpt from a Lionel Richie song in his username, came over and was trying to troll me. It's like, well, I don't know who this person is. It's so that the addition of an anonymity by way of technological mediation, right? That it introduces, all sorts of nonsense to the human exchange of ideas, for example. But anyway, and I don't mean nonsense in a favorable Deleuzian way. But anyway, I don't want to digress any more than that if that was a digression. But I think that Ellul's point is very, very important and relevant here. Okay. Section 6, cult value versus exhibition value. So originally, or radically, what mattered regarding works of art was their existence, not their being on display. That is, their being a spectacle. With the emancipation of the various art practices from ritual, go increasing opportunities for the exhibition of their products. The production process of works of art changes to better accommodate exhibition value, thus illustrating another motor force through which technological reproducibility penetrates the work of art ontologically, right? I mean, this was one of the reasons why, if you consider a philosophical presentation or a university lecture or something like that, if you consider that a work of art, I mean, that was one of the motor forces for me to convert over to PowerPoint even, for example, was its portability, its ability to be reproduced. This is how Benjamin's essay states the point from the previous slide in the early 1936 second version of the work of art. Quote, "The scope for exhibiting the work of art increased so enormously with the various methods of technologically reproducing it that a quantitative shift between the two poles, the poles of cult and exhibition value, a quantitative shift between the two poles of the artwork has led to a qualitative transformation in its nature." I really appreciated that phrasing. And so even though it was in the second version of the essay from 1936, I absolutely wanted to share it with you. And this is another way to say that, the increasing technological mediation has penetrated the ontology of human existence. So, section 7, photography and legacy. In photography, exhibition value begins to displace cult value all along the line. But cult value does not give way without resistance. It retires into an ultimate retrenchment, the human countenance. It is no accident that the portrait was the focal point of early photography. The cult of remembrance of loved ones, absent or dead, offers a last refuge for the cult value of the picture. So on the one hand, Benjamin articulates here the place of retreat for cult value, the use value of photography in the cult of remembrance. On the other hand, Benjamin, on the next slide, points to the political function manifest through the controlled exhibition of images with captions and the exhibition of meaning through the controlled juxtaposition of images. And of course, in other places, this becomes a sort of technical philosophical concept for Benjamin, this idea of profane illumination. But for us here, what we want to see is that on this next slide, it points to the political function and that it is manifest through controlled exhibition. Okay. Photographed for the purpose of establishing evidence, right? Think about before there was photography. With Atget, photographs become standard evidence for historical occurrences and acquire a hidden political significance. They demand a specific kind of approach. Free-floating contemplation is not appropriate to them. They stir the viewer. He feels challenged by them in a new way. At the same time, picture magazines begin to put up signposts for him, right ones or wrong ones, no matter. For the first time, captions have become obligatory. And it is clear that they have an altogether different character than the title of a painting. The directives which the captions give to those looking at pictures in illustrated magazines soon become even more explicit and more imperative in the film, where the meaning of each single picture appears to be prescribed by the sequence of all preceding ones. So again, you can see this almost innocence of the photograph as it's then taken sort of directly into a political function. All right, Section 8. Section 8, Cinema in the Service of Capital. When the age of mechanical reproduction separated art from its basis in cult, the semblance of its autonomy disappeared forever. The resulting change in the function of art transcended the perspective of the century. For a long time, it even escaped that of the 20th century, which experienced the development of the film. So I'll comment here on Dr. Wurtzer in a moment, but so just as film technologically manifests as a new media without a tradition, it was placed in the service of politics and capital. So I've got so much to say about Dr. Wurtzer. I studied under Dr. Wurtzer, and he was the original supervisor for my dissertation. And you can see his book here, Filming and Judgment. I see his book, Filming and Judgment. I'm in the process of putting together a seminar on this book right now. But I see this book as participating in the very tradition that we're talking about right now and really emphasizing the topics that we're looking at right now in sections 7 and 8, especially from Benjamin's work of art essay. So I just wanted to kind of place him here on this slide and remind us that that book exists And I am going to be putting together a seminar on it very soon, I hope. All right, so I'll say much more about Dr. Wurzer then. I should stick closer to the topic for the present. So the point of view of the camera, section 9. The artistic performance of a stage actor is definitely presented to the public by the actor in person. That of the screen actor, however, is presented by a camera with a twofold consequence. First consequence, the camera need not respect the performance as an integral whole. Hence, the performance of the actor is subjected to a series of optical tests. The film actor cannot adjust to the audience. This is the second consequence. Cannot adjust to the audience in the way of a stage actor. This changes the audience's relation to the performance. You know what I mean? The audience's identification with the actor is really an identification with the camera. Consequently, the audience takes the position of the camera. I really think this is profound. So this passage comes from the conclusion of section 9 of Benjamin's early second version of the essay. The film director occupies exactly the same position as the examiner in an aptitude test. To perform in the glare of arc lamps, and wow, there is a glare. You can see if you look into my pupils, you can see the glare of these lamps, and it's warm too. We'll maybe someday we'll increase the production cost, and then we'll have softer lights or something. So. Forgive me. The film director occupies exactly the same position as the examiner in an aptitude test. To perform in the glare of arc lamps while simultaneously meeting the demands of the microphone, which I just bumped, is a test performance of the highest order. To accomplish it is to preserve one's humanity in the face of the apparatus. It seems as though it would be more consistent with Benjamin's theme to say preserve the semblance of one's humanity, right? I do feel constricted. I was talking on the telephone with a friend of mine before I started record today, and I was just talking about this. I was like, well, I feel constricted and constrained in ways when I'm recording these videos that makes the experience very different from being in a classroom. And I think that's exactly what Benjamin is talking about. At the same time, I'm kind of been embracing the animation and kind of been embracing the different things that you can do with palettes. You can see the palette colors of the words and the Philosophemes channel palette, hex code colors and whatnot. So I'm kind of embracing these things that you can do with technology, but it is still very different, and I would say less natural from just gathering with some other humans and talking. Teaching a philosophy course and speaking into a microphone in front of a camera are two quite different activities. Okay, section 10. The crisis of the theater. This section echoes the point made in the previous section that film actors perform for a camera and not for an audience. However, in this section, he relates this idea to the previous discussion of aura. So here's Benjamin. He says, this situation might also be characterized as follows. For the first time, and this is the effect of the film, man has to operate with his whole living person, yet foregoing its aura. For aura is tied to his presence. There can be no replica of it. So actors become like stage props, showing that art has left the realm of beautiful semblance. As you could say, instead of beautiful semblance, it's a more contrived semblance. necessarily so. I mean, ontologically so. It's not possible to produce the semblance without the contrivance of the mechanical reproduction, of the technological mediation. Section 11, in framing reality in terms of the spectacle. In this section, Benjamin discusses the sense in which an actor is alienated from its image produced by the camera. And I thought this was absolutely relevant. Johnny Depp talks about this often. He talks about it on Letterman. He references it as if, anybody anyone who has seen him speak in more than one place would know exactly what he's talking about. So I've heard him reference this many times. So he says that, this is his infamous refusal to watch himself in a movie. So he claims that he's never seen himself perform as, is it Captain Jack Sparrow? So I find that to be very interesting. And of course, Benjamin is talking about this directly, this sense in which, because there is so much technological mediation, that it actually alienates the actor from the image produced by the camera, even though the image produced by the camera is the image of the actor. So film responds to the shriveling of the aura by artificially building up the personality outside the studio. The cult of the movie star, fostered by the money of the film industry, preserves that magic of the personality, which has long been no more than the putrid magic of its own commodity character. So, just as photography sought the cult of remembrance, film seeks the cult of personality, the cult of the movie star. Think of action figures and the actor as commodity. So just as social media has turned us into our own paparazzi, the cult of the movie star retroactively imbues being filmed with a kind of status. That's Benjamin's idea, and that idea is, I think it is supremely well articulated, and it is a super profound idea. So once being filmed is treated in this way, then the manner in which reality is filmed appears to be of greater importance. Thus, filming becomes a political weapon. It is inherent in the technique of the film, as well as that of sports, that everybody who witnesses its accomplishments is somewhat of an expert, right? So, banging into the microphone. So, there have been several people who just, off the cuff, no big deal, have critiqued what I'm doing, as if, just to be completely dismissive of it. And of course it pertains to these filming aspects, right? So someone said that there's too much animation in my little animated philosophemes. And I thought, well, that's the point. And then I thought, well, but that has nothing to do, like, what? So, it's just kind of amazing. Now, I realize this is why these philosophy professors don't write anything. Well, they don't make videos either, because, you're just going to be criticized. But hey, that's okay. That's okay. For those who have the ears for it and the philosophers of the future. But Benjamin's point here is spot on, right? That it is inherent in the technique of the film that whoever views it feels as though they're an expert in relation to it. Similarly, the newsreel offers everyone the chance to rise from passerby to movie extra. You still see it, nowadays in like bloopers or whatever, although of course Baudrillard's point is well taken that everything might be staged. It's hard to say what's staged and what isn't staged anymore, but there is some sense in which, to be put in the newspaper, to see one's name in the newspaper, to happen to be at a place when the news station shows up, and to happen to be in the video a little bit, what an amazing experience. What an amazing thing. You got to go home and get on the landline and call all your friends and tell them, hey, watch the news tonight because, fix the antenna so you can watch the news. All right. Okay. Benjamin's final point here is subtle. We must pay close attention to grasp it. He suggests the distinction between author and public is about to lose its basic character. The difference becomes merely functional. It may vary from case to case. At any moment, the reader is ready to turn into a writer. As expert, which he had to become willy-nilly in an extremely specialized work process, even if only in some minor respect, the reader gains access to authorship. To present it verbally is part of a man's ability to perform the work. Literary license is now founded on polytechnic rather than specialized training, and thus becomes common property. So let's try to pull out the subtle meaning here. When the issue is no longer possessing talent, but rather possessing access to the technology, then the situation is ripe to become completely politicized. Instead of aura and merit, there is spectacle and political pandering. I mean, I truly believe, if you watch videos, so I watched some videos on YouTube about how to make videos for YouTube, and when you watch these videos, I mean, they just come right out and tell you, right, that you need to have a minimum of X whatever equipment, right? And in a deep sense, it's true. The audience, we might say, expects something in regard to the quality of the images that are being presented. And that, the truth of that statement then shows that even if you are, so even if you don't know what you're talking about, you can give the semblance of being some sort of specialist or expert simply by way of the quality of the technology that is projecting your semblance, that is mediating you and the audience. There's something, and of course, Benjamin's concluding thought to that is that that's why it's so easily made into a political weapon. And I think that in some sense, this is what is kind of, just politics is just destroying everything. I still remember, but of course nowadays, someone would say to me, what else is there? What else is there? Why would you not? What's the Plato quote that they love to throw around? Well, if you're not interested in politics, then I guess you're going to be, whipped by a despot. But the idea here is that, I remember being in grad school when we're sitting around and we're trying to understand Deleuze, right? There's this profound text, this magnificent, tremendous, colossal philosophy, right? I mean, just amazing stuff. And everyone is talking about how they want to go home and watch Obama on television. And I started to get a sense of something. I started to get a sense that, I remember the thought that came to my mind was that just as in the previous section, we saw the cult of personality and we saw the cult of the movie star. The thought that crossed my mind at the time was that politicians, they're trying, are trying to turn politicians into the new rock stars, right? That they're trying to turn politicians into the new movie stars. And so the idea is something like, there's an inherent weaponization there, because, as they become the rock stars and the movie stars and these cults of personality, then the status, so to speak, of the rock star and the movie star diminishes, other than perhaps in the eyes of children, right? And that yet there's this status that is still there. And of course, that status draws people to these individuals and to the messages that these individuals are disseminating. And, I just, immediately it's like, well, it is technological reproducibility. It is technological mediation. And this is why it is the turning of a politician, a technologically mediated politician, into a political weapon, the filming. And so again, we talked about this in the postmodernism seminar a little bit, but again, the whole thing is already latently there in Benjamin's essay. All right, here we go. This is a fun section. Section 12, the cameraman versus the painter. Here is the question, according to Benjamin. How does the cameraman compare with the painter? The shooting of a film, shout out to Hudson here. I wonder, I'll have to send a link to him so that he can come and take a look at this. So here's the question. How does the cameraman compare with the painter? The shooting of a film, especially a sound film, affords a spectacle unimaginable anywhere at any time before this. That is to say, in the studio, the mechanical equipment has penetrated so deeply into reality that its pure aspect, freed from the foreign substance of equipment, is the result of a special procedure, namely, the shooting of the specially adjusted camera and the mounting of the shot, together with other similar ones. The equipment-free aspect of reality here has become the height of artifice. The sight of immediate reality has become an orchid in the land of technology. In other words, it is by way of technological mediation that a product is produced that is supposed to be reality without technologically being mediated. But of course, this product does not and cannot exist without the technological mediation. So this section could also be called the spectacle and so-called reality TV. So some of my friends, I'll just keep this in general. I don't want to, put anyone on blast or get anybody in trouble or whatever. But some of my friends have actually been on reality TV shows, and they asked me, "Hey, watch this," so I watched it, and I said, "Is it true? Like, there's some sort of a crisis situation, that's trying to be resolved or whatever, and so to draw in the audience and be like, this is supposed to be all be real, and not contrived, but we're going to draw the audience into this tense crisis and then resolve it by the end of the episode." And I said, "Was that real?" And my friend said, "No, absolutely not. The whole thing was contrived." They had suggested that there was some time constraint on something, and there was no time constraint on anything. But of course, that then you've got these people acting as though they're in a hurry, and oh my goodness, what's going to happen if we don't meet this deadline? But there was no deadline. So, reality TV. Next here, section 12 still, the painter. So we talked about the cameraman. The painter maintains in his work a natural distance from reality. The cameraman penetrates deeply into reality's web. There is a tremendous difference between the pictures they obtain. That of the painter is a total one. That of the cameraman consists of multiple fragments which are assembled under a new law. So Benjamin goes on to note that despite this truth, the camera's ability to penetrate reality allows it to produce a film that appears more natural than does a painting. Benjamin considers a painting whole, critiquing the montage manner in which the film is composed. This can be directly constellated with the film as a political tool, teaching the masses how to thematize their experiences. So it's not just the content, but it's the logic behind the construction of the film, the logic behind the placement of the scenes, the juxtaposition, if you will. And that logic in and of itself, we'll see here in a moment, but that logic in and of itself can be communicated, though, of course, unconsciously. Okay, the critical versus the progressive attitude to art. And I have to admit, when I first saw this, I did not know what progressive meant here. So progressive seems, what you're thinking about progressive in this context may be incorrect. So let's stick with it. And I do have a big block quote here, but it's worth taking a look at. So the difference between Benjamin's second and fourth versions is illuminating here, the second and fourth versions of the essay, the work of art. So in the second version, he says, the representation of human beings by means of an apparatus has made possible a highly productive use of the human being's self-alienation. The nature of this use can be grasped through the fact that the film actor's estrangement in the face of the apparatus is basically of the same kind as the estrangement felt before one's appearance in a mirror. A favorite theme of the Romantics. But now the mirror image has become detachable from the person mirrored and is transportable. And where is it transported? To a sight in front of the masses. Naturally, the screen actor never for a moment ceases to be aware of this. While he stands before the apparatus, he knows that in the end he is confronting the masses. It is they who will control him. Those who are not visible, not present while he executes his performance, are precisely the ones who will control it. This invisibility heightens the authority of their control. It should not be forgotten, of course, that there can be no political advantage derived from this control until film has liberated itself from the fetters of capitalist exploitation. I mean, all this philosophy on YouTube is just for the sake of being monetized, right? Or I guess it's to enlighten the masses. I don't know. What are they doing? Film capital uses the revolutionary opportunities implied by this control for counter-revolutionary purposes. Counter-revolutionary purposes. Not only does the cult of the movie star, which it fosters, preserve that magic of the personality, which has long been no more than the putrid magic of its own commodity character, but its counterpart, the cult of the audience, reinforces the corruption by which fascism is seeking to supplant the class consciousness of the masses. Let's take a look at the other version and then we'll talk about this. So Benjamin refers here to the sense in which, like the cult of the movie star or the internet star now, the technological mediation of the camera exalts the person's inauthenticity. Benjamin calls this a highly productive use of human self-alienation. At the end of the fourth version of the essay, he states this, saying, fascism gives the masses a chance to express themselves rather than their rights, namely their right to change property relations, their right to the modes of production. These are, of course, the property relations brought about by fascism. In other words, you may be homeless, but you have the chance to be an Instastar. Of course, your chances supposedly increase if you make a clown of yourself. Self-alienation and inauthenticity. He claims this is further fascist exploitation of the masses. I just want to say this very quickly before we look at the fourth version then, is that at the bottom of this quote, this idea of it being counter-revolutionary. So we talked about this in the postmodernism seminar, and I think that this is a point that people just are resistant to, and that is this idea that, and let me just be explicit. Let me not beat around the bush here, right? So this idea that it was already exploitation and self-alienation and the cult of the movie star that did things like produce action figures, right? So if it's the case that it was already counter-revolutionary exploitation, then the idea is of exploitation of the masses. Then the idea for it now to be something like, well, white people got to enjoy this, right? Namely, although it's never formulated like this, that white people got to enjoy being exploited and exposed to counter-revolutionary purposes. So because white people got to enjoy that, now non-white people should enjoy it too, right? I mean, that's kind of the message, right? Is that, well, hey, we sold you the white Spider-Man, so now we're going to sell you the not white Spider-Man. And, because we can't figure out anything else to sell you anyway. But also this idea that it taps into this political motivation of race and racism. But what's interesting about this is that, again, this idea that it's just more exploitation. It's just more exploitation. This idea that Wonder Woman was supposed to end sexism and end racism and pay off my student loans, but all it did was entertain me, And I think that this is a very important philosophical point. And if you think about the texts that are clustered around Benjamin's, that I noted to you at the beginning of the seminar, that are clustered around Benjamin's essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, then you see that theme is present in all of them. In the Society of the Spectacle, it is absolutely the case that Debord makes this explicit, that it's just exploitation followed by exploitation. So this idea that the masses buy into this, well, I've got to go watch this movie because, I support the political movement that this movie refers to or supports or whatever, that at bottom, it is just another way to sell the movie. In the fourth version, Benjamin uses the distinction between a critical and a progressive attitude toward art. And I think that this is a very important distinction. And again, it's not immediately clear what he means by progressive. So let's take a look at it. Mechanical reproduction of art changes the reaction of the masses toward art. The reactionary attitude toward a Picasso painting changes into a progressive reaction toward a Chaplin movie. So the critical attitude toward a painting versus the progressive reaction toward a film. And he defines it here. The progressive reaction is characterized by the direct, intimate fusion of visual and emotional enjoyment with the orientation of the expert. So this is a kind of crescendo culmination of a lot of the ideas that we've been looking at inside of this essay. Such fusion is of great social significance. The greater the decrease in the social significance of an art form, the sharper the distinction between criticism and enjoyment by the public. The conventional is uncritically enjoyed, and the truly new is criticized with aversion. Again, the comparison with painting is fruitful. A painting has always had an excellent chance to be viewed by one person or by a few. The simultaneous contemplation of paintings by a large public, such as developed in the 19th century, is an early symptom of the crisis of painting. a crisis which was by no means occasioned exclusively by photography, but rather in a relatively independent manner by the appeal of artworks to the masses. So you can see this idea of watching movies on your phone, which it's interesting that so many of these cinematographers, directors, and so forth are hoping to roll back, right? But this idea of being able to watch movies on a phone. And, for many people, that way they can watch bits and pieces of a movie while they're on break at work. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. But at the same time, you can see that what Benjamin says here about painting seems to be true about cinema, is that is a symptom of the crisis of film, right? The crisis of cinema. And some people have said, I mean, I'm not going to get into this here. We'll talk about films later. But some people have said that, when you watch some of the movies that have just come out, there is some sense in which they're clearly symptomatic. They clearly indicate the death of cinema. I think people have been saying this for a very long time, but things are so politicized now that, and we've already talked about this in this seminar and in other seminars, but I just think that it really is true that the fatal hour has struck for art. Okay, so lastly here, Benjamin concludes the fourth version of the essay by pointing out what is clearly still true in regard to content on the internet as well. Namely, the technical capacities of film invoke a progressive attitude. That is, film can be directly enjoyed. Think of how we laugh at comedies. I still laugh out loud sometimes at certain comedies. And I'll tell you, the scene in The Big Lebowski where John Goodman is smashing the red sports car, I still think that it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life. And I used to watch The Big Lebowski on VHS during my lunch hours. I worked across the street from my apartment when I worked at the mental health board, and I would walk home and eat lunch, and I would just play The Big Lebowski. And so I've seen The Big Lebowski. I didn't have cable. I didn't have internet. But I've seen The Big Lebowski, therefore, easily over 100 times. No Country for Old Men became a movie that I watched for over and over again so many times too. But the point is that no matter how many times I've seen The Big Lebowski, if I watch that scene, I cannot help but laugh out loud. I'm sure sometimes I cried. I was laughing so hard. So it's clearly the case that the technical capacities of film invoke a progressive attitude. You can hear John Goodman's shoes shuffling on the pavement, and it's just hilarious. So, whereas paintings invite the audience to ponder them, that is, invoke a critical attitude. So hence the distinction between critical and progressive. I think that, it's possible, depending on what kinds of things you've consumed before entering the Van Gogh Museum, that some of the Van Gogh paintings may seem animated to you, but at the end of the day, Benjamin's point is still correct. Just as technology birthed film, Benjamin points out that film's invoking of a progressive attitude provides a new opening through which to manipulate and control the masses, right? I mean, so this progressive attitude, you are directly able to tap into the emotions of the audience. All right, 14, unconscious optics, close-ups and slow motion. So anticipating colonoscopies, among other procedures, Benjamin invokes Freud and the scientific uses of film. Here's Benjamin. Actually, if we think of a filmed action as neatly delineated within a particular situation, like a flexed muscle in a body, it is difficult to say which is more fascinating, its artistic value or its value for science, demonstrating that the artistic uses of photography are identical to its scientific uses. These two dimensions, having usually been separated until now, will be one of the revolutionary functions of film. So Benjamin still holds out the possibility of revolutionary function of film, despite the fact that he suggests that it's being used in counter-revolutionary ways. Our bars and city streets, our offices and furnished rooms, our railroad stations and our factories seemed to close relentlessly around us. Then came film and exploded this prison world with the dynamite of the split second, so that now we can set off calmly on journeys of adventure among its far-flung debris. With the close-up, space expands. With slow motion, movement is extended. This idea of bullet time, even, especially bullet time in video games like Nier Automata, just outstanding. An interesting use of film to study ontology. Benjamin speaks of another nature opened up for inspection by technological mediation. So again, this I just very quickly here to Zizek, right? This other nature is another dimension, because dimension means measurement. So by gaining access through technological mediation to this new measurement of nature, this new dimension of nature, right? That in and of itself, even if you insist upon being a materialist, that in and of itself is another dimension, right? And with these dimensions that technological mediation opens up for us, we are able to recognize more and more the truth of what Immanuel Kant taught us, and that is, we do not know the thing in itself. Here's Benjamin. Just as enlargement not merely clarifies what we see distinctly in any case, but brings to light entirely new structures of matter, slow motion not only reveals familiar aspects of movements, but discloses quite unknown aspects within them, aspects which do not appear as the retarding of natural movements, but have a curious gliding, floating character of their own. Clearly, it is another nature which speaks to the camera as compared to the eye. Other, above all, in the sense that a space informed by human consciousness gives way to a space informed by the unconscious. And we're going to get a clarification of that here, and that clarification is needed. Whereas it is commonplace that, for example, we have some idea what is involved in the act of walking, if only in general terms. We have no idea at all what happens during the split second when a person actually takes a step. We are familiar with the movement of picking up a cigarette lighter or a spoon, but know almost nothing of what really goes on between hand and metal, and still less how this varies with different moods. This is where the camera comes into play. With all its resources for swooping and rising, disrupting and isolating, stretching or compressing a sequence, enlarging or reducing an object. It is through the camera that we first discover the optical unconscious, just as we discover the instinctual unconscious through psychoanalysis. So importantly here, Benjamin uses the term unconscious in a criteriological way, right? Not an ontological way. That is, he is not speaking of the unconscious. I forgot my quote, end quote there, but he's not speaking of the unconscious. So just to be clear, because, I find like these kinds of things get confusing sometimes, right? But so very quickly, he is not referring to this ontologically in the Freudian sense, right? As if to say like the unconscious is producing these things. So therefore, unconscious, the term unconscious here is meant in a criteriological way. However, in terms of nature, in terms of cosmos, right? In terms of the thing and the event, then we are talking about, when we're talking about this new nature, we are talking about ontology then. But still, that ontology is not Freud's the unconscious. I think it's very important to get clear there. I think that lots of people just sort of smash all that together or don't even recognize that that there are multiple things being discussed there. So, okay. All right, we're almost done. Section 15, the hijacking of thought. Just as the Dadaists sought to produce works that would be useless in regard to contemplation or contemplative immersion and a critical attitude, right? So too, this is what the public seeks in film, right? So this is again this idea that, watching these films, you'll see quotes. I think later in this presentation, I may not have excerpted them for you, but basically this idea of just the mind-numbing quality of television that we've known about for a very long time now, right? So this sense in which the brainwave activity that occurs by being exposed to television. So it's in this sense that it works against contemplative immersion. It's escaping me who says this. It's in this essay, though, the idea that the images, it's Duhamel, the images move so quickly and change so quickly that it's not possible to think about them, that rather it is as if the film is thinking for you. Okay, so here's Benjamin. Dadaist manifestations actually guaranteed a quite vehement distraction by making artworks the center of scandal. One requirement was paramount: to outrage the public. From an alluring visual composition or an enchanting fabric of sound, the Dadaists turned the artwork into a missile. It jolted the viewer, taking on a tactile quality. It thereby fostered the demand for film, since the distracting element in film is also primarily tactile, being based on successive changes of scene and focus, which have a percussive effect on the spectator. One of the things that I see this all the time on, for example, investigation discovery shows, that when a case is being discussed, sometimes they'll only have an image from, I'm talking about 48 Hours and Dateline and, Evil Lives Here and what is American Monster, so that often they'll just have a picture, a photograph of somebody from the 1980s. And what they do, of course, is they, across time, if you're looking at this on a timeline in DaVinci Resolve, or if you're looking at Premiere Pro, for example, that what they're doing is they are zooming out or zooming in, and also moving the position of the photograph or moving the position of the image. And so they do this, and then they time it so that, they're saying something about this person, turns out, they're a cannibal. And while they're saying this, they time the movement, the zooming out and the moving, that's all happening at the same time. They time it so that, by the time they get to the end of the sentence, then the movement stops, and then it shifts at that moment to another scene, to another visual. And oftentimes also they will use the audio to mask the transition of the visual scene. So in other words, you'll be looking at a scene of some mound of dirt in a backyard where somebody had been buried, and all of a sudden you'll start to hear a voice of a detective, and then even though you're hearing the voice of the detective while you're looking at this photograph, then suddenly it'll shift from showing you the photograph to showing you the actual detective talking into the camera. So these sort of amazing tactile ways in which film and the techniques of filming can be used, even when you really only just have a photograph from the 80s or something. All right, and this deep sense in which it sort of lulls you into a progressive attitude. And I'm always still thinking about the logic of what's going on there, but it does definitely lull you into this this progressive attitude, so much so that it sort of opens you up to these victim statements, and then you're just like, I mean, some of the things that are on Evil Lives here, I mean, it's like, it's almost like by proxy trauma to witness some of these things and witness some of these people recounting what happened to them. The progressive attitude to film. And so the point of all this is that there is absolutely a sense in which film can hijack thought, right? And that film can influence the flow of thinking, right? That film can influence and communicate a logic of thematization, just like the scenes are being spliced together in this montage thematized way, that the logic to that thematization is being communicated, even if not obviously or consciously so. All right. It thereby fostered the demand for film, since the distracting element in film is also primarily tactile, being based on successive changes of scene and focus, which have a percussive effect on the spectator. From an alluring appearance or persuasive structure of sound, the work of art of the Dadaists became an instrument of ballistics. It hit the spectator like a bullet. It happened to him, thus acquiring a tactile quality. It promoted a demand for film, right? This is the Illuminations translation, which I actually really like this translation. But so let's go further though. Let us compare the screen on which a film unfolds with the canvas of a painting. The painting invites the spectator to contemplation. Before it, the spectator can abandon himself to his associations. Before the movie frame, he cannot do so. No sooner has his eye grasped a scene than it is already changed. It cannot be arrested. That's funny. Anyway, so through the movements of the camera and the splicing technique of montage, the director is able to pace the audience perception, one more exploitable aspect for fascism. Quoting the French author Georges Duhamel, quote, "I can no longer think what I want to think." Duhamel was also a medical doctor, I believe. "I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images." So the spectator's process of association in view of these images is indeed interrupted by their constant sudden change. This constitutes the shock effect of the film. And this term shock effect becomes a kind of technical philosophical concept in the history of philosophy, especially philosophy of film here. But so this constitutes the shock effect of the film, which, like all shocks, should be cushioned by heightened presence of mind. By means of its technical structure, the film has taken the physical shock effect out of the wrappers in which Dadaism had, as it were, kept it inside, the moral shock effect. There's a lot of things we could say about that, but let's let it go for now so we can get to the rest of this. So section 16, the spectacle's sleight of hand. Benjamin here speaks of a, quote, a change in the mode of participation. The masses are a matrix from which all customary behavior toward works of art is today emerging newborn. Quantity has been transformed into quality. The greatly increased mass of participants has produced a different kind of participation. The fact that the new mode of participation first appeared in a disreputable form should not mislead the observer. Again, quoting Duhamel, who declared movies to be, quote, a pastime for helots, which is a class between the slaves and citizens. A pastime for helots, a diversion for uneducated, wretched, worn-out creatures who are consumed by their worries, a spectacle which requires no concentration and presupposes no intelligence, which kindles no light in the heart and awakens no hope other than the ridiculous one of someday becoming a star in Los Angeles. I think in this context, this idea of doom scrolling, I think has a role in this context. This idea that you have these worries and you subscribe to these channels, and then these channels show you these images that sort of reinforce your belief and in your worries. I suppose that's in some way the nature of an echo chamber. It's also an indication of the political weaponization of technological mediation. And also not just a star in Los Angeles. I mean, who wants to be in Los Angeles now, right? Rather an Insta star from home or wherever they are in the Bahamas nowadays. So clearly, this is in essence, according to Benjamin, the ancient lament that the masses seek distraction, whereas art demands concentration from the spectator. That is a commonplace. I think it appears in every Woody Allen movie ever made, right? But this calls for closer examination. Distraction and concentration form an antithesis, which may be formulated as follows. A person who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it. He enters into the work, just as, according to legend, a Chinese painter entered his completed painting while beholding it. By contrast, the distracted masses absorb the work of art into themselves. So, in the first case, a person concentrating before a work of art is absorbed by the work of art, and then now the distracted masses absorb the work of art into themselves. This is most obvious with regard to buildings. Architecture has always offered the prototype of an artwork that is received in a state of distraction and through the collective. The laws of architecture's reception are highly instructive. And I've seen these philosophy of architecture courses and discussions. I personally have not taught yet a philosophy of architecture. I think it would be a lot of fun to do that. But to the extent that they don't include Benjamin, I feel as though it's not maybe immediately clear to participants why the philosophy of architecture is sort of grounding for this philosophy of art and technological mediation. So from here, Benjamin discusses architecture as a work of art. The human need for shelter is permanent, right? This is despite the fact that there are these Marxists on the internet saying that, I have to say, so Marx, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs was essentially around since Aristotle, and Marx himself in the German ideology can be seen. I mean, I'll read it to you at some point in a short little episode or something, but Marx himself can be seen articulating what we now call Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this idea that somehow it's anti-Marxist to embrace the hierarchy of needs, I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, if you don't have shelter, I mean, hey, in Colorado, if you don't have shelter, you might get eaten by something. I mean, I guess, you might get eaten by something in San Francisco too. But anyway, so architecture has never had inactive periods. Its history is longer than that of any other art, and its effect ought to be recognized in any attempt to account for the relationship of the masses to the work of art. Buildings are received in a twofold manner, by use and by perception, or better, tactilely and optically. So you can see how he's developing this idea of the tactile also. Such reception cannot be understood in terms of the concentrated attention of a traveler before a famous building. On the tactile side, there is no counterpart to what contemplation is on the optical side. Tactile reception comes about not so much by way of attention as by way of habit. Hence this entry point into my dissertation. But the latter largely determines even the optical reception of architecture, which spontaneously takes the form of casual noticing, rather than attentive observation. Under certain circumstances, this form of reception, shaped by architecture, acquires canonical value. For the tasks which face the human apparatus of perception at historical turning points cannot be performed solely by optical means, that is, by way of contemplation. They are mastered gradually, taking their cue from tactile reception through habit. So now the stage is set to see the sleight of hand. Even the distracted person can form habits. What is more, the ability to master certain tasks in a state of distraction proves that their performance has become habitual. The sort of distraction that is provided by art represents a covert measure of the extent to which it has become possible to perform new tasks of empirical apperception. Since, moreover, individuals are tempted to evade such tasks, art will tackle the most difficult and most important tasks wherever it is able to mobilize the masses. It does so currently in film. Reception in distraction, the sort of reception which is increasingly noticeable in all areas of art and is a symptom of profound changes in empirical apperception, finds in film its true training ground. Film, by virtue of its shock effects, is predisposed to this form of reception. It makes cult value recede into the background, not only because it encourages an evaluating attitude in the audience, but also because, at the movies, the evaluating attitude requires no attention. The audience is an examiner, but a distracted one. The alternative translation here, the public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. I really like the Illuminations translation better, that the public is an examiner, but an absent-minded one. So think of how short social media posts are by design. All right, here we are at the end. So the epilogue, fascism and social media as consolation. The crowd, this Kierkegaard epigram, as it were, the crowd is untruth. The growing proletarianization of modern man and the increasing formation of masses are two aspects of the same process. Fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations, meaning to have some control over the modes of production, have some access to modes of production. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. The violation of the masses, whom fascism, with its Führer cult, forces to their knees, has its counterpart in the violation of an apparatus which is pressed into the production of ritual values. All efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing: war. War and war only can set a goal for mass movements on the largest scale, while respecting the traditional property system. I really think that sentence is profound. So this is the political formula for the situation. The technological formula may be stated as follows. Only war makes it possible to mobilize all of today's technical resources while maintaining the property system. This is almost this idea of I've heard when I was a student in relation to this text in grad school, for example, I've heard comments of things like war as a means to sacrifice lives in the effort to respect the traditional property system. So whether you go in for that kind of thinking or not, I just wanted to mention that some people have said those sorts of things. The power of anonymity, right? It goes without saying that the fascist apotheosis of war does not employ such arguments, right? So only war makes it possible to mobilize all of today's technical resources while maintaining the property system. Here is an excerpt that Benjamin concludes his essay with, and you could say, in a sense, it is a kind of declaration of futurism or the futurist. So let's take a look at it and then see how it in a sense relates to Benjamin's essay. For 27 years, we futurists have rebelled against the idea that war is anti-aesthetic. We therefore state, war is beautiful because, thanks to its gas masks, its terrifying megaphones, its flamethrowers, and light tanks, it establishes man's dominion over the subjugated machine. War is beautiful because it inaugurates the dreamed of metallization of the human body. War is beautiful because it enriches a flowering meadow with the fiery orchids of machine guns. War is beautiful because it combines gunfire, barrages, ceasefires, scents, and the fragrance of putrefaction into a symphony. War is beautiful because it creates new architectures like those of armored tanks, geometric squadrons of aircraft, spirals of smoke from burning villages, and much more. So, let art flourish and the world perish, says fascism, expecting from war, as Marinetti admits, the artistic gratification of a sense perception altered by technology. So I think that this is this sort of grand culmination of Benjamin's essay as it's pulling these ideas together, right? The ontological penetration of technological mediation, that a sense perception altered by technology. And so that war is beautiful poetry, that futuristic poetry or poetry of futurism that we just took a look at, is indicative of a sense perception altered by technology. So Benjamin suggests that let art flourish and the world pass away, or the world perish, says fascism, expecting from war the artistic gratification of a sense perception altered by technology. This is evidently the consummation of art for art's sake. Humankind, which once in Homer was an object of contemplation for the Olympian gods, has now become one for itself. Its self-alienation has reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. Such is the aestheticizing of politics, as practiced by fascism. Now, Benjamin here says communism replies by politicizing art, but I don't know that this is merely a strategy of communism. I mean, politicizing art in this context, so here, to politicize art here means to recognize its function in the culture wars and to recognize how technological mediation weaponizes art. So my thought is that to point out the fact that, they're just painting the action figure a different color and selling it over to you again, pointing that kind of stuff out, I don't know that that's necessarily in the service of communism, but I think that it is in the service of freedom. I think it is in the service of liberation in the face of the fascist machine. It is worth, I just want to repeat this statement one more time because I just think it is just so tremendous. That humankind's self-alienation has reached a point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure, and that is the aestheticizing of politics.